Get him out! Now! The words cut clean through the polished air of the lobby, sharp and effortless, as if they belonged there more than the man they were meant for, and for a moment everything seemed to pause. The quiet hum of the overhead lights, the soft echo of dressed shoes across the marble floor, even the muted conversation at the front desk, as all eyes shifted toward the figure standing just inside the glass doors. A man wrapped in a worn coat that had seen too many winters, his shoes damp from the rain that had been falling steady for the past 20 minutes, a thin sheen of water tracing its way across the spotless tiles beneath him, while he stood still, not defiant, not apologetic, just present, as if he had every right to be exactly where he was. Which only seemed to irritate Nathan Whitmore more as he adjusted the cuff of his tailored sleeve and stepped forward with the kind of controlled authority that came from believing everything around him was his to manage, his to shape, his to remove if it didn't fit the image he had worked so carefully to maintain, because this building wasn't just a workplace to him, it was a statement. 42 floors of glass and steel rising over downtown like a declaration of order and success, and nothing, not a smudge on the windows, not a misplaced chair, and certainly not a homeless man dripping rainwater onto imported marble, was going to disrupt that illusion. You heard me, Nathan added, his voice lower now but somehow colder, directed at the two security guards who had already started moving, their footsteps deliberate, practiced, closing the distance between themselves and the man near the entrance. And still, the man didn't move, didn't even flinch, his eyes drifting slowly across the lobby as if taking in details no one else noticed. The pattern in the stone, the reflection of the chandelier above, the faint scuff near the elevator bank that had gone unpolished. Before his hand lifted slightly, not to stop them, not to resist, but to brush his fingers lightly against the wall beside him, a quiet, almost absent gesture that went completely unnoticed by everyone except the receptionist who watched from behind her desk, her brows knitting together just slightly as something about it didn't feel like fear or confusion, or even resignation, it felt familiar. Like someone returning to a place they knew by heart, but Nathan didn't see that, or if he did, he chose to ignore it, because what he saw was a problem to be removed, a disruption to be corrected. Sir, we're going to have to ask you to step outside, one of the guards said, his tone polite but firm, the kind of voice that left no room for argument, and still the man remained calm, his gaze lifting now to meet Nathan's for the first time, and there was something in that look, not anger, not pleading, something steadier, something that didn't match the worn fabric or the damp edges of his coat, that lingered just a second longer than expected before he spoke, his voice quiet but clear. You might want to check who you're asking to leave. And for a brief second, the words seemed to hang in the air, unnoticed by most, dismissed almost instantly by Nathan, who let out a short, humorless breath as he shook his head. I know exactly what I'm doing, he replied, already turning slightly, as if the situation was beneath any further attention. This is private property, and people like you don't just walk in here whenever they feel like it. The phrase landed heavier than he intended, or maybe exactly as he intended, drawing a few uncomfortable glances from nearby staff who quickly looked away, unwilling to be part of whatever line had just been crossed. But the man didn't react, not outwardly, his expression remaining composed as the guards reached him, one stepping to his side, the other gesturing toward the door, and finally, he moved, not forced, not hurried, simply turning and walking with them as the glass doors slid open, letting in a rush of cool air and the steady rhythm of rain against the pavement outside, and as he stepped out onto the sidewalk, the reflection of the building's name stretched across the glass behind him, tall silver letters etched into the surface, catching the light just enough to be seen through the gray haze of the afternoon, and for a moment, just a moment, he paused beneath it, his eyes lifting toward those letters, his name, though no one inside seemed to realize it, while behind him the doors closed again with a soft, final sound, sealing the warmth and order back inside, leaving him alone in the rain, calm, unmoved, as if the moment had gone exactly as expected, while inside, Nathan Whitmore straightened his jacket and walked away, unaware that something far more permanent than a first impression had just been set in motion. The rain did not let up, not even a little, as it traced steady lines down the glass facade of the building, turning the city outside into a blurred reflection of gray and silver while Elias Carter stood just beyond the overhang where the shelter ended, the cold seeping slowly through the thin layers of his coat, yet he did not move to escape it, did not step farther away or try to find cover. Instead remaining where he was as if the weight of the water and the wind meant less to him than the quiet hum of memory that lingered in that exact spot, his eyes lifting once more to the towering structure above him, 42 floors reaching into the low clouds, every window reflecting a version of the sky that looked identical but was never quite the same, and for a moment his breathing slowed, not from exhaustion, but from something deeper, something rooted in recognition. Because long before the polished marble floors and the carefully curated lobby sent and the uniformed staff trained to smile at exactly the right angle, there had been blueprints spread across a small wooden table, coffee rings staining the edges, late nights measured in quiet determination rather than comfort, and hands that built something not for status, but for permanence, hands that had once signed every approval, reviewed every detail, walked every unfinished hallway when the floors were still concrete and the walls still exposed steel. And now those same hands hung loosely at his sides, unnoticed, unrecognized, dismissed by a glance that never cared to look twice, while inside the building, life resumed its carefully controlled rhythm, the sound of elevators chiming softly, conversations picking back up in hushed professional tones, and Nathan Whitmore stepping into one of the mirrored cars with a subtle exhale as if the inconvenience had already been filed away and forgotten. His reflection staring back at him in clean lines and sharp edges, a man who believed in structure, in order, in the idea that everything had its place and everyone knew it, yet something about the moment lingered just beneath the surface, not enough to concern him, but enough to create a faint disturbance he could not immediately name, a flicker in the back of his mind tied to the way the man had looked at him, not with fear, not with anger, but with a kind of steady awareness that did not match the situation, and as the elevator doors closed and began their smooth ascent, Nathan adjusted his tie once more, grounding himself in the familiar routine. The predictable environment that had always rewarded control, while several floors below, the receptionist who had watched everything unfold found herself glancing again toward the entrance, her fingers pausing over the keyboard as she replayed the image of the man's hand brushing the wall, the way he had paused beneath the building's name, and something about it unsettled her, not because it was disruptive, but because it felt intentional, like a gesture that belonged to someone who knew more than he was showing. Though she quickly shook the thought away, returning to her work as the steady rhythm of the office reclaimed her attention. Outside, Elias finally shifted, not hurried, not uncertain, simply taking a slow step back from the doors as the reflection of the building stretched across the wet pavement beneath him, his gaze lowering now to the surface where the letters appeared reversed in the water, distorted but still readable if one knew what to look for, and a faint breath left him, not quite a sigh, not quite relief, something quieter, something patient, as if time itself had not been disrupted at all, as if this moment, this dismissal, this quiet removal from a place he knew better than anyone inside it, was only a small piece of something much larger already in motion, and without another glance toward the guards who had already turned away, without any sign of frustration or urgency, he began to walk, not far, not away from the building entirely, but along the edge of the block where the rain softened against the concrete and the city moved around him. Without noticing, each step steady, measured, carrying with it the quiet certainty of someone who had not lost anything at all, even as the world around him believed otherwise. By the time Nathan Whitmore stepped out of the elevator onto the 32nd floor, the rain had already faded into a distant background noise, replaced by the low, controlled rhythm of a high-level workspace where everything moved with quiet precision, glass walls separating conference rooms filled with muted discussions, screens glowing with financial projections, and assistants walking with measured steps that never echoed too loudly against the carpeted floors, because this was the part of the building where decisions carried weight, where numbers translated into power, and where Nathan felt most at home. His posture straightening slightly as he walked past rows of offices, offering brief nods that were returned with equal restraint, his presence acknowledged but never questioned, until he reached his office at the far end, a corner space lined with floor-to-ceiling windows that framed the city in a way that made it feel smaller, more manageable, as if everything below existed within reach, and for a moment he paused just inside the doorway, setting his phone down on the desk with a soft, deliberate motion before glancing out at the skyline, the rain still visible as a faint haze over the streets, and something about it pulled his thoughts back, not fully, not enough to disrupt his focus, but just enough to echo the image of the man standing outside earlier, unmoved by the weather, unmoved by the dismissal, a detail that did not quite fit into the narrative Nathan preferred, because in his world, people reacted, they adjusted, they showed either discomfort or resistance. But they did not simply accept a moment like that with calm certainty. And that inconsistency lingered for a second longer than he liked before he turned away, brushing it aside as he sat down and opened the file waiting on his desk, a thick binder filled with tenant reports, maintenance schedules, and financial summaries that required his attention, because this building was not just a symbol, it was a system, one that demanded constant oversight, and Nathan took pride in maintaining its standard, flipping through pages with practiced efficiency until a small detail caught his eye, a note flagged in the margin of a recent audit report, something about ownership documentation that had been marked for review, and while it should have been routine, the wording felt slightly off, not incorrect, just incomplete, as if a piece of information had been assumed rather than confirmed, and without fully realizing why, he reached for his phone again. Dialing the extension for the administrative office downstairs, his fingers tapping lightly against the desk as the line rang once, twice, before a voice answered, steady and professional. "Administrative records, this is Laura." And Nathan leaned back slightly in his chair, keeping his tone casual, controlled. "Laura, I need you to pull the latest ownership file for the building, full documentation, including any recent updates." There was a brief pause on the other end, the faint sound of typing beginning almost immediately. "Of course, Mr. Whitmore, give me just a moment." And as he waited, Nathan's gaze drifted again toward the window, the city stretching endlessly beyond the glass, his reflection faintly visible over it, composed, certain, a man who believed in clarity, yet beneath that surface, something unsettled continued to press quietly, not urgent, not alarming, just persistent enough to keep his attention from fully settling, and when Laura's voice returned, it carried a slight hesitation that had not been there before. "Mr. Whitmore, I have the file here, but it looks like some of the primary ownership records are archived under executive clearance." Nathan's brow tightened just slightly, his fingers stilling against the desk. "Then request access," he replied, his tone sharpening by a fraction, because this was not how things usually worked, not for a property of this scale, not for a manager in his position, and yet as the seconds stretched, the quiet hum of the office around him seemed to fade just a little, as if the building itself was holding something back, something he had not yet fully seen, and for the first time since stepping into his role, Nathan Whitmore felt the faintest shift in control, subtle but undeniable, like a detail just out of focus, waiting to be brought into view. Nathan Whitmore did not like delays, not in meetings, not in numbers, and certainly not in information that should have been immediately accessible to him, so when the silence on the line stretched just a fraction too long after his last instruction, his fingers resumed their quiet tapping against the desk, a controlled rhythm that mirrored the growing tension beneath his composed exterior, while across the building, deep within the administrative office where rows of filing systems had long since been replaced by secure digital archives, Laura adjusted her headset and leaned closer to her screen, her eyes scanning lines of data that did not align the way she expected, because the ownership file she had pulled was not incomplete, it was restricted, layered behind multiple levels of clearance that did not match standard property management access, and that alone was unusual enough to make her pause. "Mr. Whitmore," she said carefully, her voice steady but carrying a subtle shift. "The system is indicating that the primary ownership profile is protected under legacy executive authorization. I can submit a request, but it may take some time to process." Nathan's jaw tightened slightly, his gaze drifting again toward the window before returning to the desk. "Submit it," he replied, his tone firm, though something in him resisted the idea that access to something as fundamental as ownership would require approval beyond his reach, because in every building he had managed before, the hierarchy had been clear, defined, and visible. But here, something felt different, less transparent, and as he ended the call, placing the phone down with a soft but deliberate motion, the quiet confidence he had carried since morning shifted just enough to make room for doubt, not doubt in his authority, but doubt in the structure he believed he fully understood. And outside, the rain had begun to ease, the steady downpour softening into a fine mist that clung to the edges of the city, leaving the streets slick and reflective, while along the side of the building, just beyond the main entrance where most employees rarely looked, Elias Carter had stopped walking, not because he was lost or uncertain, but because he had reached a point he remembered, a narrow section of the exterior wall where the stone changed ever so slightly in texture, a detail invisible to most but unmistakable to him, and once again his hand lifted, resting briefly against the surface, his fingers tracing a faint line where two panels met, a place where years ago a decision had been made to adjust the design, to reinforce a section that had not met his standard, and the memory came back not as a flash, but as a quiet continuation, as if time had simply folded around it, his expression unchanged, calm, patient, while inside, several floors above, Nathan stood from his desk and moved toward the window, his reflection merging with the city beyond as he tried to settle the unease that had begun to take shape, because it was not just the restricted file, it was the accumulation of small inconsistencies, the man's composure, the way he had spoken, the absence of reaction, all details that did not belong together in the way Nathan expected, and as he stood there, the faint sound of a notification broke through the silence, his computer screen lighting up with an incoming message from the administrative system, the subject line simple, direct. Ownership access request update. And for a brief moment, everything else seemed to fade, the quiet office, the distant city even. The reflection in the glass. As Nathan turned back toward the desk, his steps measured but no longer entirely at ease, his hand hovering over the mouse for just a second before clicking to open the file, unaware that what he was about to see would not just clarify the structure of the building, but unravel the certainty he had built around it, piece by piece. Beginning with a name he had already dismissed once without ever truly seeing it. The screen did not change all at once, not in a dramatic flash or a sudden reveal, but in small, deliberate lines of text loading into place, each detail appearing with quiet precision as Nathan Whitmore leaned slightly forward in his chair, his eyes narrowing as the file expanded beyond the limited summary he had expected, the header simple, almost understated. Primary ownership record. Followed by a series of legal identifiers and timestamps that traced the building's history back years. Further than his own involvement, and at first nothing seemed out of place, the structure of the document familiar, the formatting consistent, until his gaze settled on a section labeled Current Beneficial Owner. And for a moment his mind did not process the name, not because it was unclear, but because it did not align with what he believed he already knew, and so he blinked once, then again, his hand tightening slightly around the edge of the desk as he read it a second time, slower now. Each letter distinct, undeniable, Elias Carter, and the room seemed to shift, not physically, not in any way that could be measured, but in the quiet recalibration of certainty that happens when a single fact refuses to fit into an established understanding, and Nathan leaned back just slightly, his breath controlled but no longer entirely steady, because the name did not belong there, not in that context, not attached to the ownership of a building he had just minutes ago treated as if it were entirely under his authority, and yet the document did not hesitate, did not offer ambiguity. It continued with a level of detail that reinforced its validity, acquisition dates, transfer confirmations, executive signatures, all aligned under that same name, and beneath it, a note indicating that the ownership structure had been intentionally kept low profile under long-standing private control, a phrase that now carried a weight Nathan had not considered before, and as he stared at the screen, the memory returned with sharp clarity, the man standing in the rain, the calm expression, the steady voice. You might want to check who you are asking to leave. And the words no longer felt like a passing remark, they felt precise, measured, intentional, and a quiet pressure built in his chest, not panic, not yet, but something closer to realization, because this was not a misunderstanding that could be dismissed or corrected. With a quick explanation, this was a reversal, complete and undeniable, and for the first time that day, Nathan Whitmore felt the structure he relied on begin to tilt, just slightly, enough to make him question not just the moment that had passed, but every assumption that had led to it, his gaze shifting quickly across the document as if searching for an error, a misprint, something that could restore the familiar order. But there was none, only confirmation layered upon confirmation, and, without fully deciding to, he pushed his chair back and stood, the movement more abrupt than his usual measured pace, his hand already reaching for his phone as a new urgency took hold, one that cut through the controlled environment of his office and replaced it with a singular focus. He needed to find him, not later, not after another meeting or another review, but now. Because the longer the distance between that moment and this realization grew, the harder it would be to close it, and as he stepped out of his office into the quiet corridor beyond, the rhythm of the building around him remained unchanged, unaware, steady, while Nathan moved through it with a pace that no longer matched its calm, his thoughts narrowing, aligning around a single point, the entrance, the street, the man in the rain, and far below, outside where the mist had begun to lift, and the city resumed its usual motion. Elias Carter continued along the edge of the block, unhurried, his steps carrying him just far enough that the building remained fully in view, its reflection stretching across the wet pavement like a memory that refused to fade, and though no one inside could see it, the distance between what had been assumed and what was true had already closed, leaving only the moment of recognition waiting to catch up. The elevator ride down felt longer than it should have, each passing floor marked by a soft chime that seemed louder now, more deliberate, as if time itself had slowed just enough to force Nathan Whitmore to sit with the weight of what he had just seen, the name still fixed in his mind with a clarity that refused to fade, Elias Carter, not as a passing detail, not as a misinterpretation, but as the confirmed owner of everything beneath his feet, and for the first time since stepping into his role, Nathan did not look at his reflection in the mirrored walls, did not adjust his tie or smooth the edges of his jacket, because the image he had relied on only minutes ago no longer felt complete, no longer aligned with the reality that had just unfolded, and when the doors finally opened into the lobby, the familiar space greeted him with the same quiet precision, the polished marble floors, the soft lighting, the distant murmur of conversation, but something in it had shifted, not in appearance, but in meaning, because now every detail he saw carried a different context, a different ownership, one he had failed to recognize when it mattered most, and his steps were quicker now, less measured, cutting across the lobby with a focus that drew a few subtle glances from staff who were not used to seeing him move without that controlled calm, the receptionist looking up briefly as he passed, her expression tightening slightly as if she sensed the change in him even without knowing why, and without slowing, without offering explanation. Nathan pushed through the glass doors and stepped outside, the air cooler now, the rain reduced to a faint mist that lingered in the atmosphere, leaving the pavement dark and reflective beneath the gray afternoon sky, and for a moment he paused just beyond the entrance, his eyes scanning the street with an urgency that contrasted sharply with the stillness of the man he was looking for, because Elias Carter was not rushing, not hiding, not disappearing into the city the way Nathan expected he might. Instead he stood several yards away near the edge of the block, his posture relaxed, his gaze directed toward the building as if he had never truly left it, as if distance meant nothing to his connection with it, and when Nathan saw him, something in his chest tightened, not from fear, but from the recognition of a mistake that could not be undone, only addressed, and he began to walk toward him, each step steady but carrying a weight he had not felt before, the distance between them closing slowly, the sound of his shoes against the damp pavement the only interruption to the quiet rhythm of the street, and Elias did not turn immediately, did not react to the approach, his attention still fixed on the structure behind the glass. Until finally, just as Nathan came within a few feet, he shifted his gaze slightly, not startled, not defensive, simply aware, and the calm in his expression remained unchanged, the same steady presence that had defined every moment since Nathan first saw him, and for a second either of them spoke, the space between them filled not with tension, but with something quieter, something heavier, the unspoken acknowledgement of what had happened and what had been revealed, and Nathan, who had spent his entire career controlling conversations, directing outcomes, found himself without the immediate words he usually relied on, his breath measured, his posture no longer as rigid as before, because this was no longer a situation he could manage with authority alone, and when he finally spoke, his voice was lower, more careful. Mr. Carter. The name felt different now, not a label, not an assumption, but a recognition, and it settled between them with a weight that neither of them ignored, while Elias simply looked at him, not with satisfaction, not with resentment, but with a quiet patience that suggested he had been expecting this moment all along, as if the rain, the dismissal, the distance, had all been part of a process that did not require urgency to complete, and in that stillness, under the fading mist and the reflection of the building stretching behind them, the balance of power had already shifted. Not through confrontation, but through truth quietly stepping into view. Nathan Whitmore had expected many reactions when he finally stood face to face with Elias Carter: resistance, anger, perhaps even quiet satisfaction, but what he found instead unsettled him in a way he had not prepared for, because Elias did not move, did not raise his voice, did not shift his posture in any way that suggested this moment carried the weight Nathan felt pressing against his own chest. He simply stood there with the same calm presence, his eyes steady, his expression unchanged. As if the truth that had just upended Nathan's certainty had always been a quiet fact to him, never needing to be proven, never needing to be announced, and that stillness forced Nathan to confront something deeper than the mistake itself. It forced him to confront the way he had seen him, or more accurately, the way he had not seen him at all, and for a brief moment the sounds of the city seemed to fade into the background. The passing cars, the distant footsteps, even the soft drip of water from the edge of the building blending into a quiet space where only the two of them existed, separated not by distance now, but by understanding, and Nathan felt it clearly, the shift, the imbalance correcting itself in a way that left no room for denial. His voice, when he spoke again, slower now, more deliberate. I reviewed the ownership file. He said, the words careful, measured, as if each one needed to be placed correctly. I was not aware. And even as he said it, he understood how insufficient that sounded, how it failed to address what had actually happened, because this was not about awareness, it was about assumption, about the ease with which he had dismissed a man based on appearance, context, and a version of order that had never truly been complete, and Elias listened without interruption, his gaze never leaving Nathan's, not challenging, not forgiving, simply present, allowing the space for the words to exist without reacting to them, and that silence made Nathan continue, not out of obligation, but because stopping there felt dishonest. You should not have been treated that way. He added, the statement more direct now, though still restrained, because this was not a man who was used to speaking from a place of apology. Yet something in him recognized that this moment required it, not as a formality, but as an acknowledgement of truth, and for a second, the air between them remained still, the weight of his words settling without immediate response, until Elias finally shifted his gaze slightly, not away, but upward, toward the building behind them, his eyes tracing the height of it as if measuring something that could not be seen on the surface. And when he spoke, his voice was calm, steady, carrying no trace of resentment. This place, he said quietly, was never meant to feel like a barrier. The words hung there, simple, but layered with meaning that extended beyond the structure itself, beyond the glass and steel and carefully maintained image, and Nathan followed his gaze, looking up at the same building he had spent his days managing, yet seeing it differently now, not as a system to control, but as something built with intention he had never questioned, and Elias continued, his tone unchanged. It was built for people to walk in and feel like they belonged, no matter where they came from. And there was no accusation in the statement, no direct reference to what had happened, yet the connection was clear, undeniable, and it settled deeper than any confrontation could have, because it revealed not just a mistake, but a misalignment between purpose and practice, and Nathan felt it, the quiet realization taking shape, not forced, not dramatic, but steady, the kind that could not be ignored once it had been seen, and for a moment he did not respond, not because he had nothing to say, but because anything immediate would have felt incomplete, and instead he stood there, allowing the silence to hold the weight of what had been revealed, while Elias lowered his gaze back to him, the calm still present, unchanged, as if the moment did not require anything more than recognition, and in that stillness, the truth of the situation settled fully into place, not as a conflict, but as a correction, one that had already begun the moment Nathan chose to step outside and face what he had overlooked, and now could not unsee. The silence that followed did not feel empty, it felt complete, as if everything that needed to be understood had already been placed between them without force or confrontation, and for the first time since stepping into his role, Nathan Whitmore allowed himself to stand in that silence without trying to control it, his posture no longer rigid, his voice no longer calculated, because what Elias Carter had said did not require a defense, it required recognition, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, Nathan nodded, not as a gesture of agreement alone, but as an acknowledgement of something deeper. Something he had overlooked not just in this moment, but in the way he had approached everything within those walls, and his gaze shifted briefly back toward the building, the glass reflecting the softened gray of the sky, the entrance standing just a few yards behind them, unchanged in structure but no longer the same in meaning. "I see that now," he said quietly, the words simple, but carrying a weight that came from understanding rather than obligation, and Elias watched him for a moment, his expression steady, as if measuring not the words themselves, but the space they came from, and there was no immediate response, no approval or dismissal, just a quiet presence that allowed Nathan to continue without interruption, and for a second, the city around them seemed to hold its breath, the faint sounds of traffic and distant conversation settling into the background as something more important unfolded in the space between two men standing on a rain-darkened sidewalk. "I cannot change what already happened," Nathan added, his voice steady but no longer guarded. "But I can make sure it does not happen again." And as he spoke, there was no trace of the authority he had carried earlier, only a directness that came from clarity, from the realization that the role he had been given was not about maintaining an image, but about upholding a purpose he had not fully understood until now, and Elias lowered his gaze slightly, not in dismissal, but in thought, his hand once again brushing lightly against the edge of the building as if grounding himself in something that had always been there, something that did not shift with perception or hierarchy. And when he looked back at Nathan, there was a subtle change, not in expression, but in the space behind it, something softer, something that suggested the moment had reached its turning point. "This place does not need perfection," he said calmly. "It needs people who are willing to see others clearly." And the words settled with a quiet certainty, not as instruction, not as correction, but as truth. And Nathan listened, really listened, the way he had not done before, the way he had not thought necessary in a world he believed was already defined, and for a moment he did not respond, because there was nothing to add, nothing to defend, only something to carry forward, and slowly, he stepped back, not away, but to the side, creating space, an unspoken gesture that shifted the dynamic without needing explanation, the entrance behind them now open, accessible, no longer a barrier enforced by assumption, and Elias did not hesitate, did not acknowledge the gesture with words, he simply moved, his steps steady as he walked toward the doors, the reflection of the building rising behind him as if aligning once more with the man who had built it, and as he passed through the glass, the interior light catching the edges of his silhouette, there was no announcement, no recognition from the people inside who continued their routines, unaware of the significance of the moment. Yet something had changed, something quiet but permanent, and Nathan remained where he stood just outside, the cool air still lingering, his gaze following the path Elias had taken, not as a manager observing a tenant, but as a man beginning to understand the weight of what he had been entrusted with, and in that stillness, under the fading mist and the steady presence of the building he thought he knew, the shift was complete, not marked by noise or spectacle, but by the quiet alignment of purpose and perspective finally meeting in the same place. Inside the building, nothing appeared different at first glance, the same soft lighting reflecting off the marble floors, the same quiet rhythm of movement as employees crossed the lobby with purpose, conversations low and controlled, the world continuing exactly as it had before, yet beneath that surface, something subtle had shifted. Something that could not be seen in the structure but could be felt in the way Elias Carter walked through it now, not with urgency, not with expectation, but with a quiet familiarity that belonged to him in a way no title or announcement could fully capture, his steps measured as he moved past the front desk where the receptionist looked up instinctively, her eyes lingering for just a second. Longer than before, as if recognizing something she could not quite name, something that had always been there but had only now come into focus, and Elias offered no explanation, no introduction, he simply continued forward, his hand brushing lightly along the edge of the wall once more, the same gesture, the same connection, as if the building itself responded not to status, but to presence, and somewhere above. In the quiet of his office, Nathan Whitmore stood by the window where he had begun. The day, the city stretching out before him in long lines of glass and steel, but his reflection no longer carried the same certainty, it held something else now, something quieter, more aware, as he watched the entrance below from a distance, his gaze following the path Elias had taken without needing confirmation of where it would lead, because the truth had already settled into place, not as a disruption, but as a correction that could not be undone, only understood, and for the first time. Nathan did not feel the need to assert control over what he saw, he simply observed, allowing the moment to exist without interference, and down in the lobby, Elias slowed near the center of the space, his eyes lifting toward the ceiling where the light filtered through in soft reflections, the same design he had once approved, the same angles he had once studied late into the night, and though years had passed, though time had shifted the way the world saw him, the essence of what he had built remained unchanged, not in its materials, but in its purpose, and he stood there for a brief moment, not claiming the space, not demanding recognition, simply present within it, as if that alone was enough, while behind the glass doors, Nathan finally turned away from the window, not with the sharp movement of authority, but with a slower, more deliberate step, as if each decision now required more than assumption, more than appearance, and as he crossed his office, the quiet hum of the building followed him, unchanged in sound but altered in meaning, because now he understood that every person who entered those doors carried a story he could not see at a glance, a truth that did not reveal itself through surface alone, and that understanding settled into him not as a burden, but as a responsibility. One that would shape every choice that followed, and outside, the rain had fully stopped, leaving the streets clear and the air still, the reflection of the building sharp once more against the pavement, no longer distorted, no longer blurred, and in that clarity, everything aligned, not through force, not through correction, but through the quiet recognition of what had always been there, waiting to be seen. And as the day moved forward without announcement or spectacle, the only evidence of what had changed remained in the silence, in the space between what had been assumed and what was now understood, a space that no longer separated, but connected, leaving behind not a victory, not a defeat, but something far more lasting, the quiet, undeniable presence of truth.